My name is Ruby, and I worked in food service, mostly front of house. So when restaurants started closing during the early days of the pandemic, I took whatever work I could find. An old friend told me about a medical office that needed someone to come in at night and do some light filing. Since I could work after the cleaning crew had left, I figured it was a good opportunity. It also meant I could avoid being around a lot of people, which was exactly what I wanted at the time. The only problem was getting there. I didn't want to take the bus because of the crowds, so I decided to use Uber instead. That night, I headed to the medical office at around 3 a.m. I was exhausted and regretting how late I had agreed to work, but I figured I could sleep when I got home. I walked out to the street and started looking around for my Uber. I was still trying to figure out where the car was when a vehicle pulled up beside me. The driver looked over and asked, "Uber?" I looked at the car and assumed it was mine. Yeah, I got in. The driver looked completely ordinary. He was young, clean-cut, and had brown hair. He even reminded me a little of my brother. He was listening to jazz, and there was nothing about him that immediately screamed danger. I didn't think much of it. The ride seemed longer than I expected, but I had only moved to the area the year before, and wasn't familiar with all the surrounding neighborhoods. I assumed the driver simply knew a different route. I was also exhausted. I tried playing games on my phone for a while, but the car didn't have a charger compatible with my phone. I wanted to save my battery because I would need it to order another ride home later. Eventually, I put my phone into airplane mode and fell asleep. I don't know how long I was out. Eventually, I heard someone calling to me. Ma'am, we're here." I was so deeply asleep that at first I thought I was still dreaming. The driver eventually nudged my leg to wake me up. I opened my eyes, realized we had stopped, and quickly got out. "Thanks." I walked toward the building, and almost immediately, something felt wrong. The place didn't look anything like the medical office I had expected. When I had looked up the address before going there, I'd seen a picture of the building online. It looked like a normal strip mall-style office complex. This place looked abandoned. The building was partially damaged, the entrance was dark, and beyond the lobby there were almost no lights at all. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that maybe they were renovating. I walked farther inside. There were construction materials everywhere. Some windows were broken. Several doors were locked. There was no sign of a medical office. I started looking around for another entrance or another section of the building, but the farther I went, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. Eventually, I took my phone out to check the address. I turned airplane mode off and waited. The signal was terrible. Still, I didn't need internet to check the messages I already had. I scrolled back through my texts and found the address of the medical office. I checked it carefully. It was the correct address, but then I realized what that actually meant. The address was correct. The building I had been dropped at was not. I wasn't standing at the medical office. The driver had taken me somewhere completely different. That realization made my stomach drop. I tried opening the Uber app so I could contact the driver and figure out what had happened, but the weak signal made the app barely load. Then I heard something. A rustling sound. It was coming from downstairs. I froze. I was on an upper floor, and the only usable staircase I'd seen was the one I'd already taken. I didn't know who was down there. The building was abandoned. It was almost 3 a.m., and I was completely alone. I tried sending a message to a group of friends. I typed out the address and asked them to call 911. The message wouldn't send. There wasn't enough reception. I started looking for another way out. I found another door marked stairs, but the staircase behind it was badly damaged. It was almost a straight drop to the floor below. I backed away. Then I heard footsteps. Someone was coming up the stairs. My heart started pounding. I quickly moved behind a large concrete support and tried to stay completely still. The footsteps got closer. Then a person appeared at the top of the stairs. It was the driver. For a moment, I felt relieved. I thought maybe he had realized he'd dropped me at the wrong place and had come back to get me. But then I thought about it. How would he even know he'd taken me to the wrong place? He couldn't have known what was wrong unless he'd been watching me. I looked at him. He looked completely calm. He was breathing heavily, though, and he was standing directly in front of the only staircase I knew I could use to leave. Something in me immediately said that I needed to get away. I don't remember thinking through what I was going to do. I just ran. I threw myself toward the damaged second staircase and jumped down the opening. I hit the floor hard. Pain shot through me, but I forced myself up. I had no idea if I'd broken anything. I just needed to get outside. I stumbled through the darkness, grabbing at doors and walls, trying to find an exit. Then suddenly, a door flew open. A blinding light hit me directly in the face. My first thought was that the driver had found me. I stumbled backward, looking for somewhere to hide. Then I heard a voice. "Name of Town Police Department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air." I didn't believe him at first. I was already completely panicked, and my brain was still convinced that I needed to run. "Get on the ground, hands where I can see them." The voice was so commanding that I finally dropped to my knees. The officer approached and moved his flashlight away from my face. That's when I realized he was actually a police officer. I tried to explain what had happened, but I couldn't get the words out properly. He asked me simple questions. "What is your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could hurt me? Would you rather talk inside or outside?" I was babbling and barely making sense. Because of how I was acting, he initially thought I might be under the influence of something. He eventually got me outside and sat me in the back of his patrol car with the door open. Once I was away from the building, I started calming down enough to speak. The first thing I asked was, "Did my friends call you?" He said no, nobody had called. He explained that he had been patrolling the area and noticed a car sitting outside the abandoned building. The building was condemned and nobody was supposed to be inside. He decided to investigate. Then I remembered the driver. I told him everything. He immediately asked me what the car looked like and whether I had any information about the driver. I didn't have much. I had been half asleep when the ride started. But then the officer had an idea. "Can you pull up your Uber app?" I tried. There still wasn't enough signal, so we drove farther down the road until my phone finally got a connection. The Uber app loaded, and that's when everything became even more disturbing. I had several notifications from Uber. One said, "Hello, I've arrived." Another said, "I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct?" Then, "I am flashing my hazards." And finally, "Unfortunately, your driver had to cancel." I stared at the screen. The driver who had taken me to the abandoned building wasn't my Uber driver at all. My real Uber driver had been waiting at the correct pickup location. The man who picked me up had simply approached me, claimed to be my Uber, and taken me somewhere else. The officer checked the vehicle information from the app. It was completely different from the car that had driven me to the abandoned building. That meant the man had deliberately impersonated my Uber driver. And somehow I'd gotten into his car without checking. The officer took my statement and said they would keep an eye out for him. Unfortunately, I couldn't give them much of a description. I remembered that he was a young-looking white man with brown hair, sideburns, and a goatee. He was wearing a zip-up sweatshirt and driving a four-door sedan. Not exactly enough information to easily identify someone. But I had survived, and I never used a rideshare service the same way again. I'd been so tired that night that I never checked the license plate. I never checked the driver's name. I simply heard the word Uber, saw a normal-looking guy in a normal-looking car, and got inside. I was lucky that police happened to be patrolling that area that night. Because if that officer hadn't noticed the car outside that abandoned building, I don't know how that night would have ended. So if you use rideshare services, don't just check the car. Check the driver's name, the license plate, and the vehicle details before you get inside. Being tired, distracted, or in a hurry can make you overlook things that normally would seem obvious. I learned that lesson the hardest way possible. My name is Megan. I worked at a veterinary clinic only a few blocks from my house. in an area that was generally considered very safe. It was mostly neighborhoods, churches, parks, and small businesses, and I'd never really been afraid of walking around there. That night completely changed the way I think about walking home alone. I was working the evening shift at the clinic, and normally I would have been home by around 7 or 7:30. But that night, one of the other kennel technicians had unexpectedly missed his shift without telling anyone. The clinic was packed, the kennels were full, and there wasn't anybody else around to take care of everything. I was tired, but I wanted to prove that I could handle it, so I told my boss I'd stay and finish everything myself. That turned out to be a really fucking stupid decision. By the time I finally finished taking care of all the animals, cleaning everything, doing the laundry, and taking out the trash, it was around 8 o'clock. It was completely dark outside. I did my last rounds through the kennels, said goodnight to the dogs and cats, started the final load of laundry in the dryer, and made sure everything was secure. Then I clocked out. I set the alarm, locked the clinic's deadbolt, and stepped outside. I'd only taken a couple of steps when I noticed 3 men standing about 300 feet away near the mailbox. That immediately caught my attention. There wasn't really any reason for 3 grown men to be standing around outside a veterinary clinic at 8 o'clock at night. The surrounding area was almost entirely residential, and there were convenience stores and other businesses farther down the road where people could actually go if they had somewhere to be. I remember stopping for a second and looking at them. One of them was looking directly at me. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and his hood was pulled up far enough that I couldn't see his face clearly. We made eye contact, and we just stared at each other. I don't know why, but something about him immediately set off every alarm in my head. I didn't know these men. They weren't doing anything obviously threatening yet, so I told myself not to overreact. I decided to simply walk around them. I kept a wide distance between us and started heading toward home. I'd taken maybe 8 steps when I heard footsteps behind me. That was all it took. I turned around and saw that at least one of the men was following me. I didn't stop to figure out what they wanted. I fucking ran. Thankfully, I already had my house key in my hand because I always carried it that way when I walked home. I sprinted back toward the clinic, fumbling with the key as I reached the door. I finally got the deadbolt unlocked and pulled the door open. And just as I was getting inside, one of the men lunged toward me. His hand grabbed at my sleeve. I slammed the door. His fingers were caught between the door and the frame. He screamed. I've never been so relieved to hear someone scream in pain. The clinic door was incredibly heavy. We'd replaced the old glass doors and windows with extremely strong, heavy-duty glass after a large dog had once broken a window. At the time, I thought the whole thing was probably overkill. That night, I was extremely grateful for it. I stumbled through the doorway trying to get away from him, completely losing my balance in the process. I fell face first onto the floor. I hit the ground so hard that I split my lip on one of my teeth and smashed my eyebrow against the floor. For a second, I couldn't even understand what had happened. Then I saw blood on my hands. That's when I completely lost it. I started hyperventilating and crying uncontrollably while trying to crawl farther away from the door. The alarm was blaring. The dogs were barking. And outside, those 3 men were now banging on the glass. They were yelling at me. The man who had grabbed me was standing directly in front of the door, staring through the glass. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't embarrassment because he'd just gotten his fingers crushed. He looked furious. He was screaming that I was a whore and that I was going to get what was coming to me. I'd never seen that kind of hatred directed at me before, and I was terrified. I don't even remember making a conscious decision to hide. I crawled underneath the counter and curled myself up as tightly as I could. The alarm continued screaming through the building. The 3 men kept banging on the windows and shouting. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I just sat there crying and shaking while listening to them outside. Eventually, they stopped. I have no idea how long it had been. It felt like forever, but I later learned it was around 15 minutes. At some point, the police arrived. Our alarm system was connected to the alarm company, and if the alarm wasn't shut off quickly, they were contacted. My boss was then notified, and the police were sent to check on the building. A Apparently, when the officers entered, I was completely unresponsive. I didn't respond when they called out to me. I didn't respond when they tried to get my attention. And according to my parents later, I completely freaked out when one of the officers touched me. I don't remember any of that. My memory basically disappears from the moment I crawled underneath that counter. The next thing I clearly remember is my parents being there. They took me to get medical treatment, and I ended up needing 2 stitches in my lip and a staple in my eyebrow. But the story didn't end there. The police eventually found all 3 men. They were caught at the CVS a couple of blocks away. And apparently, the man who had grabbed my sleeve had broken 3 fingers when I slammed the door on his hand. They were buying finger splints. One of the other men had also apparently fallen and injured himself while they were running away. As horrible as the whole thing was, I have to admit there was something slightly satisfying about learning that even these pieces of shit were clumsy enough to hurt themselves. But then the police told us something that made the entire situation even more disturbing. They'd gone back through the clinic's surveillance footage, and they discovered that these men hadn't just happened to be outside that night. They had been watching me for at least a week. The cameras showed them hanging around the side of the clinic on multiple days. They'd apparently been watching the building and waiting. The reason they hadn't approached me earlier was that I usually wasn't alone. Some nights my parents picked me up. Other nights one of my bosses stayed behind and talked with me for 30 or 40 minutes after closing. So there had been witnesses around me. That night was different. I'd stayed late. I was alone, and the 3 men were waiting outside. The police also discovered that all 3 men had outstanding warrants for drug charges and assaults. One of them was connected to several car break-ins in the area. I was asked to testify in court as both a witness and a victim, and I agreed. I still think about that night sometimes, especially knowing they'd been watching the clinic for at least a week. I'd always considered the neighborhood safe, and I'd never thought twice about walking home alone. I don't anymore. If you're leaving somewhere late at night and notice people hanging around for no obvious reason, don't worry about whether you're being paranoid. Go back inside. Call someone. Get a ride if you can. It's better to feel stupid for being cautious than to find out you were right to be afraid. I still work at the clinic, and it's actually the best job I've ever had. But I never walk home alone anymore. Not at night. Not after midnight. And definitely not after what happened that night. Because sometimes the safest thing you can do is trust that little voice telling you something isn't right. And I'm really fucking glad I listened to mine. My name is Clara, and this happened about 1.5 years ago, on a cold Friday morning in January. I had already had a rough start to the day. I had been working 10-hour shifts all week, which usually turned into 12-hour days because of how busy things were, and I had just found out that I was pregnant the week before. That morning I woke up late after repeatedly silencing my alarm without even realizing it. I normally never had problems getting to work on time, but that day I was exhausted and had to rush out of the house. I had about 25 minutes to get to work, so I skipped breakfast, threw on some clothes, tied my hair back, and got in my car. I didn't even let the engine warm up before leaving. I was almost to work when I noticed my gas light had come on. I still had a few minutes, so I decided to stop at a gas station just off the highway and fill up. I pulled up to a pump and got out. There was a man around my father's age filling up a white work truck at the pump directly in front of me. I didn't think much of him because there were a lot of construction crews working near my workplace at the time. While I was waiting for the gas to finish, I texted a friend from work to let her know I was almost there. Then I got that feeling that someone was watching me. I looked up and caught the man from the work truck looking directly at me. The moment our eyes met, he looked away. A second later, the pump clicked off. I finished filling the tank, got back into my car, and prepared to leave. I still had about 5 minutes before I absolutely needed to be at work, which should have been enough because I was only a few minutes away. I pressed the start button. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. The battery was dead. I immediately thought about my dad. He's a mechanic, And one of the things he had always told me was never to skip letting my car warm up in cold weather. Of all mornings, I had chosen this one to ignore him. I tried starting the car again, but it was completely dead. That's when the man in the white work truck noticed I was having trouble. He walked over and asked if I needed help. I told him I thought my battery had died. He said he could jump-start it, but he didn't have jumper cables in his truck. He worked on one of the bridge construction crews nearby, though, and said he had a set at the job site. He offered to drive over, get them, and come right back. I told him he didn't have to go through all that, but he insisted that it wasn't a problem. At the time, I didn't see any reason to distrust him. He looked like an ordinary construction worker, and I assumed he was just trying to help someone who was stranded. My husband was asleep at home because he worked third shift, and my dad was already at work, so I decided to accept the help. The man left to get the cables. While I waited, I called my boss and explained that my car had died and that I would be late. She offered to send someone to help me, but I told her the man from the work truck had already gone to get jumper cables. A few minutes later, he returned. He hooked up the cables and we got my car running again. We let it run for a few minutes while we made small talk. Nothing about the conversation seemed particularly strange at first. Then he asked me if I was a nurse. That immediately caught my attention. I wasn't wearing scrubs, so I wondered how he knew. He noticed my expression and quickly explained that he had seen my license plate when he came back with the jumper cables. My license plate was one of the state-issued plates for nurses. That explanation made sense, so I relaxed a little. I told him that I was a nurse and that I was actually running late for work. He asked if I worked at the hospital nearby. I told him I didn't. He seemed surprised and asked where I worked instead. I didn't want to tell a complete stranger exactly where I worked, so I simply told him that I worked at a facility nearby. He asked a couple more questions, but I kept my answers vague. Eventually, he disconnected the jumper cables. I thanked him for helping me, got back into my car, and watched him drive away. I waited for him to leave first before pulling out myself. I was slightly uncomfortable by then, so instead of driving directly to work, I took a different route. It felt a little paranoid, but I figured there was no harm in being cautious. Once I got to work, I completely put the incident out of my mind. I spent the rest of the day in mandatory training, and aside from briefly mentioning the dead battery to a few coworkers, I didn't really think about the man again. By the end of the day, I was exhausted and just wanted to go home. I walked out toward my car. That's when I noticed something tucked underneath the driver's side windshield wiper. A piece of paper. I stopped. For a moment, I wondered if it might be a note from my best friend. She worked at a hospital a few blocks away, and we sometimes left little notes on each other's cars. But then I remembered the man from the gas station. I looked around the parking lot. There was no sign of him. I walked up to the paper and pulled it from underneath the wiper. It wasn't from my friend. It was from him. At the top was his phone number, followed by a message telling me to call him soon. Then it got much worse. He wrote that he felt we had a connection, that he believed we were two souls who were supposed to meet. He said he knew there was a reason he had been at that gas station that morning, right in front of me. According to him, the fact that he had been there when my car broke down wasn't a coincidence. He believed it was fate. He wrote that he had been searching for someone like me for years, and that he couldn't simply let me disappear after finally finding me. I dropped the paper immediately. My heart started racing. He had found me. He knew what kind of work I did. He knew where I worked, and somehow he had found my car in a parking lot that wasn't visible from the main road. I immediately called my husband, my parents, and a few people I trusted. I didn't want to drive home alone. The more I thought about it, the more disturbing it became. At the gas station, I'd never told him exactly where I worked. I had only told him that I worked at a nearby facility. He had also told me that he lived a couple of hours north of the area. So how had he found me? He would have had to locate my specific workplace, and then somehow identify my car among all the vehicles in the parking lot. And I knew he hadn't simply followed me there. I had watched him leave the gas station in the opposite direction, and I had taken a different route to work specifically because I was worried he might follow me. Yet somehow, he still found me. After that, I stopped walking to and from my workplace alone. For months, someone accompanied me whenever I arrived or left, especially because it was dark during those hours for much of the year. I never saw the man again, but that didn't mean I stopped thinking about him. Even now, if I suddenly get the feeling that someone is watching me, part of me remembers that parking lot and that piece of paper. The whole thing started because I was in a hurry and my battery died. If my car had started that morning, I probably never would have met him. And if I had never met him, he never would have had a reason to find me.